When I was 35 years old and had been seeing a spiritual director for 2 years, I was invited to do a 5-day vision fast in the wilderness. The mere thought of it terrified me, but I said yes. I knew I was supposed to do it, even though I didn't know why. A vision fast is one form of a rite of passage. It's based on the Native American vision quest. The person who led me was trained by the School of Lost Borders in California. As a mother of 2 young children, I thought I had already been through all the rites of passage I could possibly go through. And yet, the vision fast in the wilderness kept calling me. In a vision fast, as in many rites of passages, there are 3 stages a person goes through. The first stage is what is known as separation or severance. Some refer to it as a border crossing. You physically leave a place in a vision fast to go to another place. On my 5-day vision fast, this meant that we awakened at dawn, did a fire ceremony, and were then sent out with the packs on our backs and enough water for 5 days. I left the circle of women and headed out on my own to find my spot for 5 days and 4 nights. When I think back on it, I realize there were other separations as well. I left work, I left my family the day before as we drove to the wilderness area where we were going to go out from. So the separation came in stages, as it often does. The second stage is known as threshold or transformation. This is what happens when you leave one space and you are somewhere else for a bit, and you are not yet where you will end up. Other words for this time of transformation can be transition, or some call it liminal space. In this time of transformation, you're leaving behind one identity, or at least part of an identity, and you are not yet sure what the next or new identity will fully be. This is the in-between time. When I walked away from my circle of women at dawn, I was leaving behind the version of me who was afraid of the dark so much that I kept lights on in the house. I knew there would be no turning lights on in the wilderness. I had some sense that there were other identities I was leaving behind as well, but I wasn't sure of the specifics. The third stage is known as incorporation. On the morning of the 5th day after dawn, I was to walk back into the circle of fire where I left on the dawn of the first day. And that was the beginning of my incorporation. Once the other 2 women were also back in the circle, we stood around the fire, but were not yet invited to speak. We then moved to a place where a simple meal had been prepared so we could break our fast. After we broke our fast, we were invited to speak one by one. After we received each other's experiences, we drove back to where we lived, which was the next part of our incorporation. We gathered at the house of our guide, and our families and communities were waiting there for us. We ate dinner together, and each of us was invited to share a portion of our experience with the whole community of 10 to 12 people. The incorporation continued after that as my congregation welcomed me back that Sunday. In so many ways, it continued long after that as friends would ask me if I would share my story of the vision fast with them. After traveling through the 3 stages and being incorporated back into community, I was still living in between worlds. I had crossed a border, stepped across a threshold into a new wilderness, and for years to come, I continued living in unfamiliar territory with Jesus as my constant companion. In the Easter story, both Jesus and the followers of Jesus go through these stages similar to many rites of passage. The Gospel of Mark is my favorite Easter story because it ends very abruptly and leaves so much up in the air. There is no bow that is tied neatly across the box of this story in Mark. We are left hanging. Doesn't it seem like that version of the story really makes the most sense? We have to go back a few days to get the stages they go through. Separation begins happening when Jesus is in Bethany at the home of Simon, and a woman with very expensive perfume comes in and bathes his feet with it. When the disciples scold her, Jesus tells them to leave her alone because they will not always have him. A couple of days later, Jesus gathers them in the upper room and tells them one of them will betray him, and then he tells them he is going to die. After that dinner, Jesus goes to Gethsemane and walks away from them with just Peter, James, and John. He again goes through separation and a kind of border crossing as he tells them to wait for him while he goes to pray. At this point, we move into the stage of threshold or transformation. The idea of a threshold is crossing into a place you cannot turn back from. A threshold place is known to be between two places or between identities or states of being. Everything Jesus knew and was working for was being threatened, and he knew that whatever was ahead, there was no going back. But he didn't want to die, and he didn't think the time was right, and he wasn't sure his followers were strong enough to carry on. Every single thing was at stake in this moment. Jesus left his closest ones behind and fell to the ground and was as honest with God and with himself as he had ever been. You know it's possible for you to keep me alive, he said to God. I don't have to suffer like this. Please take this suffering away from me. I thought this was the way to go, but I don't think so anymore. And then Jesus said, but I trust you know even more than I do, so I will go with your lead. At some point, it becomes clear to Jesus that it is time to face what is ahead, or to move into the final part of his life. And the third stage of incorporation begins. The world is different now, and he is different now, and then the betrayal happens. I don't want to recount everything we recounted on Maundy, Thursday, but the same stages can be seen through Jesus' arrest, death, and burial. The story of Jesus dying, being buried, and then rising is this journey of separation, threshold or liminal space, and then incorporation. Jesus' rising was the incorporation and the taking on of a new identity. A new identity doesn't have to mean a completely different identity. It simply means you are a different person than you were before the separation. Jesus' incorporation happened over days, apparently, as in some of the Gospels we hear that he appeared to some and then others and had conversations and had dinner and made breakfast on the beach. Mark's Gospel leaves the story with the empty tomb and nothing beyond the fear of the women. Let's look at the stages through the followers. Separation happens when Jesus dies. We think it is the ultimate separation. The story in Mark tells us Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for Jesus' body. Joseph was a council member, so he both knew and had access to Pilate. And he also believed Jesus' message of the coming realm of God on earth. After Pilate had the centurion confirm that Jesus was dead, he gave the dead body to Joseph. Joseph bought a linen cloth, wrapped Jesus up in it, and laid him in a tomb that had been carved out of rock. Jesus then rolled a stone against the entrance, surely to keep animals out. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where Jesus was laid. The burial is the threshold or transformation moment. All they know is that Jesus is literally between two worlds, between earth and whatever comes next. And so are they. Because of the strict laws about Sabbath, the women did not go back to the tomb until early in the morning after the Sabbath was over. They had spices they had bought to anoint Jesus' body, and they went to the tomb just after sunrise. They wondered on the way who would roll the stone away from the entrance. When they looked up and got there, they saw that the stone had already been rolled away. They went into the tomb and saw a young man in a white robe sitting on the right side of the tomb. They were startled, probably a big understatement. The young man said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see Jesus there just as he told you." Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The women are experiencing incorporation, though it may not seem like it. They're trying to figure out what just happened. They were between two worlds for 3 days, and now they were in a different world, but they have no idea where that world is. Their terror and dread and fear is what we would expect for people living in between two worlds or in liminal space. In his book Soulcraft, Bill Plotkin defines liminal space as a threshold between two worlds or states of being. He explains that liminal space is a place of transition where individuals leave behind their old identities and enter a period of uncertainty and transformation. There isn't a single one of you here today who hasn't experienced living between two worlds. Every single one of us has experienced thresholds, transitions, transformations, changes in identity, rites of passage, liminal spaces, the changing of our world in an instant, leaving us to wonder what world we will end up in eventually. Most of us go through this threshold experience, these rites of passages, many times over. And sometimes we miss them completely. And by miss them completely, I mean we don't necessarily notice them or acknowledge them or enter into them intentionally or take time to process them or do any rituals surrounding them. In an article titled "Lost in Liminal Space," one author writes this: "Modern society, though, with its myriad of distractions and coping mechanisms, stands in the way of the introspection necessary for our individual rites of passage, an essential human experience. Addiction to technological devices offers places to hide and ways to avoid. We numb our minds with substances and social media platforms to avoid emotions, especially anxiety and depression. We obligate ourselves, our time, the processing ability of our brains with our busyness. And we choose to seek comfort in the familiar, in the jobs we despise but begrudgingly still report to, in familiar people, and in habitual consumerism of things we don't need but we hope will keep the dread away. In contemporary life, it's largely up to the individual to recognize when a separation is needed, and also how to navigate the liminal space. The hardest phase due to the high degree of uncertainty from leaving behind one's identity and not yet assuming or understanding fully a new one. The author raises a good question. How are we to know when a separation is needed? In other words, how will we know when we need to cross a particular border or threshold? And then how are we to navigate the threshold, the transitional, the liminal space? We are living between two worlds, and how do we know we'll come out intact? How does this change when we are thrust across a threshold instead of choosing to walk across? As I look around this morning and see you all, many of you whom I know well, I see the transitions you are going through. Job searches, living situations, health and mental health issues, living in a new city, major shifts in identity, aging milestones, anticipated retirement, caregiving demands, loss of physical mobility, shifting family structures, deaths and births, deep grief. All of us who are living in the city of Chicago are in a huge threshold moment. We are saying goodbye to one mayor and welcoming a new one. We are saying goodbye to alders and welcoming new ones. Our identity as a city is shifting, and we are in between identities, and we have no idea who we will become. And has there ever been a moment in U.S. history when we haven't been in between worlds as we continue to try to become what we declared ourselves to be and still haven't achieved? What can help us through these times of transformation, threshold, liminality, transition? One of the things that can help us is having a guide. Someone we know is with us, holding us, offering us invitations or reflections, or even just someone we know will hold silence with us. Jesus' guide was God. We get confused because of the words attributed to Jesus from the cross when he was said to have cried, "My God, why have you left me?" But if we look at everything else that happened along the way, we can see that Jesus had ultimate and deep faith in God's leading. In the garden, Jesus hoped with all of his being that God would create a way forward that did not include death. And then Jesus walked into the hands of his betrayers because he knew God was leading him across that particular threshold. Most of us need guides that are in the flesh human beings because we are not as skilled at listening and hearing how God might be leading moment by moment. Our guides come in the form of therapists, psychiatrists, spiritual directors, pastors, best friends, mentors, partners, and even the more than human world. I told you that a few weeks ago, I spent 5 days listening to the forest while forest bathing with my partner Jeanette as our guide. Guides come in many forms and can lead us through all kinds of difficult times. Increasing our ability to be silent and listen is something else that can help us as we cross various thresholds. When we are in between worlds, we often experience deep discomfort, fear, anxiety, and even pain. Who wouldn't want to rush right past all of that, right through it? And the harsh reality is that if we rush it, if we push the river, as we sometimes call our grasping of control, we miss out on the gifts of the time. While it may not seem like there are gifts, I have lived enough life by now to know that if we are willing to lean into the discomfort, if we are willing to trust that there is a deep process going on inside of us that is necessary, we will, on the other side of the whole experience, come to a place where we can say there were some gifts in that time. Hear me carefully, though. I am not saying the gifts outweigh the terribleness. I am not saying everything will come out okay. Jesus died during the threshold time. There is no denying that, and other people die during the threshold time too. What I am saying is that during the time where we have crossed a border from one world into another, and we don't know where we are or where we are going, that time can be a time of incredible transformation. The School of the Lost Borders says this: the modern-day vision fast is a border-crossing practice. When one steps across the threshold and into the unknown wilderness, boundaries begin to dissolve and our vision begins to expand. Everything is pregnant with meaning, and nature speaks to us in the voices of rock, tree, and wind. Following the ancient pathway of this rite of passage, we step into our true nature and remember our home among the wild. We become who we were born to be. It's important to point out that when we talk about this particular thing, we're talking about a choice being made. I think we also need to be clear about the fact that there are people, particularly people of color in this country, who live between two worlds constantly and not by choice. When the followers of Jesus stepped across the threshold of Jesus' death, they were so transformed that here we are all of these years later declaring, Jesus is risen. Jesus is risen indeed. We say that Jesus rose from the dead because the followers of Jesus were so enlivened that they traveled the world as they knew it in those days, sharing the good news of Jesus' love with justice. If we fill our lives with noise, with distractions, with striving and with things, we might miss the thresholds we are crossing and the opportunities for deep change and transformation. One last thing, though by no means final, that can help us through our threshold or border crossings is community. Jesus was surrounded by community, and even though they ended up betraying him, deserting him, and not understanding him at all, they were still his community. Our communities are like that too sometimes. I am a parent, as are many of you. I think of myself as the closest community to our kids. And sometimes I am the Peter who denies. Or I am the James and John who fall asleep at the wheel and doesn't see what's happening as it's happening. I have been a failure at times. And the weird truth is that I am still close community for our kids. I love them with all of my being, and I would do anything for them, and like every other mother, there are some things I cannot prevent or protect them from, despite my meddling. And some days I am so tired, I fall asleep. I used to fall asleep reading to them when they were kids. Our communities are not perfect. But we need them. And at some level, despite their failures, we know they love us because they show up over and over and over again. When Jesus was dying, he saw 3 women who stayed with him the entire time, the 2 Marys and Salome. His community couldn't prevent his death, but they were there in their imperfect ways before, during, and after. And they loved him fiercely and then spent their lives sharing how Jesus' insistence on a completely different vision had impacted and completely changed them. When I crossed the threshold or border back into community after my vision fast, I began the years-long process of coming out and becoming my more authentic self. It was excruciating, and I lived in between worlds for years. Jesus was my constant companion because I knew that Jesus knew suffering intimately and that he was willing to stay with me. When I think of what it means that Jesus lives, that Easter is real, as some would like to say it, I think of all the times in my life that I have either stepped across or been forced across a threshold, and Jesus has been there too. So have my guides and my community, and my feeble attempts to be silent long enough to hear what was being spoken. What about you? Where are you? If you are right now living between worlds, where is Jesus in all the worlds? Who are your guides? Who is your community? How is your silence? Ironically, at least I think of it as ironic, part of the message of Easter is that you are not alone. If Mark 16, verse 8 had been the end of the story, our threshold times would be very different. But instead of disappearing, Jesus somehow, and I use that word intentionally, began showing up in this terrible in-between worlds place the followers were living. We have a variety of stories that tell us that in the worst time and place of their lives, Jesus showed up. If you are in one of those times, let me know if you need a guide, if you need community, if you need help with silence. We don't have to go it alone, though we are the only ones who can walk our particular path between worlds. The threshold place, the border crossing, the liminal space is a place of becoming if we can just let ourselves be there for a time. And while there, may we look and listen for who or what is with us there. Amen.